The quiet suburban street looked picture-perfect, trimmed lawns, white fences, and an HOA that prided itself on keeping order. But when a black woman parked her SUV outside her own home, neighbors whispered, phones rang, and within minutes, flashing red and blue lights lit up the block. The homeowners association had called the cops, claiming she didn't belong there. What they didn't know was that the woman they tried to humiliate wasn't just a neighbor. She was the county sheriff, and the moment her badge came into view would shake the entire community to its core. The neighborhood had a reputation for being exclusive. Families saved for years to buy a home there, believing the promise of safety and order the HOA boasted about. But behind the manicured hedges and monthly newsletters lay something far uglier, an unspoken belief about who truly belonged. Danielle Williams had worked her entire life to protect her community. Decades of service in law enforcement had earned her not only respect but also one of the highest honors, being elected as the county sheriff. Off duty, though, she was simply a single mother, proud of finally purchasing a home in this very neighborhood, a place she hoped would give her teenage son stability and peace. But from the moment she moved in, Danielle noticed the stares. Some neighbors smiled politely, others quickly looked away, and a few made their disapproval clear with thinly veiled comments. She brushed it off at first, used to being underestimated. Still, the quiet disapproval began to weigh on her. On that humid, summer evening, Danielle had returned late from work. She wore plain jeans and a sweatshirt, her badge tucked away in her bag. Pulling into her driveway, she barely had time to step out before she noticed curtains twitching. A neighbor across the street picked up the phone, glaring as if a stranger had just trespassed. Danielle sighed, tired but unsurprised. Minutes later, the sound of sirens sliced through the calm night. 3 police cruisers rolled in, lights bouncing off garage doors and windows. Neighbors spilled onto porches, murmuring, watching. Danielle stood frozen, her groceries still in hand. She knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was the beginning of something much larger. The officers stepped out of their cruisers, with hands resting firmly on their belts. Their body language carried a mix of authority and suspicion, the kind Danielle had seen countless times in her own career. But now, she was on the other side of it. The HOA president, a tall man in a pressed polo shirt, hovered near the edge of the driveway, gesturing toward Danielle as though presenting evidence. "That's her," he said loudly enough for everyone on the block to hear. "She doesn't live here. She was loitering. I saw her unloading things into that house, probably breaking in." Whispers rippled through the crowd that had gathered. A few neighbors looked uneasy, while others crossed their arms, satisfied that order was being restored. Danielle's heart pounded, not out of fear but out of anger. She had lived through years of situations like this, moments when her skin color turned her into a suspect in the eyes of strangers. Still, it was different seeing it unfold in her own front yard, a place she had worked so hard to call home. The officers approached, asking questions in clipped, commanding tones. "Ma'am, can we see some identification? What are you doing? At this residence?" Danielle held back the urge to reveal her badge immediately. She wanted to see how far this would go, how deep the assumptions ran. Her grocery bags rested at her feet, a carton of milk slowly leaking from a cracked corner. She calmly answered, "This is my home." Her words were met with skepticism. The HOA president shook his head and muttered, "See? She can't prove." "Right," another neighbor chimed in. "She doesn't fit in here. We know everyone in this neighborhood." Danielle's son Marcus peeked through the blinds inside the house. His wide, frightened eyes locked on his mother as the flashing lights painted the walls behind him. Danielle forced herself to stand tall, her years of training reminding her to stay composed, even as humiliation burned in her chest. The minutes dragged like hours. Radios crackled, neighbors whispered, and every second without resolution tightened the knot in Danielle's stomach. She thought about the countless black families across the country who faced similar treatment, families who didn't have the protection of a badge in their purse. And then, one officer placed his hand on his handcuffs, the metallic jingle loud enough for the crowd to hear. Danielle knew this was the moment, the line between injustice and revelation. She reached slowly into her bag, her voice calm but firm. "Before you take another step, there's something you should know." The officers hesitated, the crowd, leaning forward as if the entire street held its breath. Danielle pulled out her leather badge holder and flipped it open, the gold star gleaming in the wash of red and blue lights. Her voice, steady but edged with fire, carried across the silent street. "I am Sheriff Danielle Williams, and this is my home." The effect was instantaneous. The officer's hand froze mid-reach, his face draining of color. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, suddenly aware of the gravity of their mistake. The HOA president's jaw dropped. He stammered, "Sheriff, that can't be." His voice trailed off as reality set in. The very woman he had accused, the neighbor he had deemed out of place and wasn't just a resident. She was the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Some neighbors lowered their eyes in shame, while others stepped back as if distance could erase their earlier complicity. Danielle let the silence linger, her gaze sweeping across the officers, the HOA president, and the neighbors who had judged her without a word of kindness. Years of discipline kept her calm, but inside her heart raced, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment. "This is what happens," she said finally, her voice sharp yet heavy with sorrow. "When you see my skin before you see my humanity, when assumptions matter more than truth." The words cut through the air like a blade. The officers straightened, standing at attention, not out of protocol, but out of shame. The HOA president opened his mouth as if to apologize, but the weight of the crowd's silence left him mute. From the window, Marcus pressed his hands to the glass, his eyes wide with pride. For him, this wasn't just about safety. It was about seeing his mother stand tall against a wall of prejudice and claim her rightful place in a world that too often tried to push her aside. The silence on the street hung heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the patrol cars. Danielle held her ground, not as a woman defending herself, but as a sheriff, holding a mirror up to her community. The officers, red-faced, muttered apologies. One by one, they retreated to their cars, their earlier authority reduced to whispers of regret. The HOA president shuffled forward, his polished shoes scraping against the pavement. His face was pale, his voice trembling. We didn't know," he stammered. Danielle's eyes locked onto his. "That's the problem. You didn't want to know. You assumed I didn't belong because you never imagined someone like me could live here, work here, lead here." Her words carried weight, not just for him but for everyone listening. Neighbors who had peeked through curtains earlier now stood outside, their expressions shifting from curiosity to guilt. Some clutched their children's hands tighter, as if silently promising them they would do better. Danielle turned toward Marcus, who had stepped onto the porch. His small frame seemed to radiate strength as he gazed at his mother with unshakable pride. For him, this wasn't only about her badge or her title. It was about dignity, about knowing that kindness and respect should never depend on skin color. She walked to her son, resting a hand on his shoulder. "This is our home," she said, loud enough for the entire block to hear. "And we are not going anywhere." The words lingered in the cool night air, a declaration and a promise. In the days that followed, whispers spread through the neighborhood. Not of scandal, but of reckoning. The HOA held emergency meetings. Policies were rewritten. The president resigned. And though some neighbors avoided eye contact, others knocked on Danielle's door with quiet apologies and homemade meals. But for Danielle, it wasn't about apologies. It was about the lesson. About making sure her son and every child watching understood that standing tall in the face of injustice was not just possible, it was necessary. Months later, when Marcus's class held a Heroes Day, he stood proudly before his classmates. While others spoke about firefighters, athletes, and astronauts, Marcus spoke about his mom, the sheriff who stood her ground when others tried to erase her worth. "Heroes," he said, his voice small but firm, "don't always fight with fists. Sometimes they fight by not letting anyone tell them they don't belong. The classroom erupted in applause, but for Danielle, the true victory was quieter. It was knowing that through pain, humiliation, and strength, she had taught her son, and her community, a lesson they would never forget. Because true authority doesn't come from a badge or a title. It comes from courage, dignity, and the unwavering demand to be seen for who you are. And that night, on that quiet suburban street, Sheriff Danielle Williams made sure the world would never again forget who she was.